Good evening from the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle. Welcome to the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series event for the fall of 2018, our first in a series of at least 6 events. I'm Mark Bernier, the moderator for tonight's event. In a sea of news stories that have involved an election coming up and foreign policy, sometimes one of the most important stories of the last 30 years is set aside for a look at North Korea and other issues in the world, monetary challenges and a strong economy, plus candidate views, race. Sometimes we forget the center of which everything was being discussed, the Middle East. Tonight, we have a seasoned military veteran with numerous awards and branches of service in the United States Army, and a man who lived among the Kurds. He is one of our own from this community, and he joins us live tonight at Embry-Riddle. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you retired Brigadier General Ernest Audino. Not too often I get to say this, General. Welcome.
Well,
good to see you.
Thanks.
I think we'll begin at the start with your distinguished career, which is, I think it's more than 32 years, including West Point. What got you into the military? What brought you in where you wanted to do this service? And then we'll talk about your escapades. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is my father's cousin was the only other member of the family who had gone on to a career in the military. And he enlisted. He was an immigrant from Italy, enlisted, fought through North Africa, Sicily, went in on D-Day with 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division on appropriately named Red Beach, fought all the way through Germany, and I always was fascinated by my distant cousin, and he lived out in Ohio, and the rest of us lived in New England, and there really wasn't a large military presence in New England. So that was my connection. Okay, so you go into the Army. Was there ever any consideration it would be any other branch of the service? Oh, no. No. My family would take picnics, and one of our picnics ended up at West Point, a 5-hour drive. And while I was there as a 10-year-old boy, I saw the cannons captured during the Spanish-American War, saw the cadets walking around, some were carrying rifles, and I said, okay, I think this is the place I want to come. In 2002, I believe under Peter Galbraith, you are embedded with Kurdish leaders. You embed yourself. How is it that you came to this assignment? Because we learn a lot about what you know about the people in this discussion. Yeah. How has it come to be? Well, it's 2002. I was at the National War College, and there were 200 students there. We had about 20 Allied students or foreign students, and these were wonderful, high-quality classmates from all walks of DOD, military, other agencies, and what have you. And we were offered, like every other university, a major or concentration, and mine was Islam in the Middle East. And one of my professors was Peter Galbraith, so he is a longtime friend of the Kurds, as the Kurds like to say. As a Senate staffer, he snuck into Iraq in 1988 during the gassing of Halabja on the 16th of March of that year, and he helped bring international attention to what is now history's largest chemical strike against civilians. In either case, Peter was one of my professors, and he encouraged me to develop a more focused concentration on Kurdish history and Kurdish culture, Kurdish issues, and I did it, and then I just kept up my studies on my own after I graduated. When you went into this, and I looked at video of you over the weekend, you said you had to think like your comrades. You had to learn to think like your comrades. How hard is that? Well, I think that's at the essence of being an embedded combat advisor. So for the folks here that might not know, my mission was to lead a team of combat advisors embedded with the Peshmerga of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is one of the 2 major parties in Kurdistan of Iraq. The other being the Kurdish Democratic Party. I was with the PUK Peshmerga, and I had a team of 10 guys. We were embedded in a Peshmerga brigade of 3,300. But during that period of time, it became very clear to me that it's relatively easy and simple to train an indigenous battalion to do anything. Let's say defend a central regime, right? Relatively simple and easy. Changing what they think is important, that's a different matter, all right? And that requires real understanding of the ethnographics, the demographics, the histories. What's that national or tribal narrative? How do they see themselves? What do they think is important? And an embedded advisor must be perceptive enough to understand those interest areas, because we cannot assume that their interests always coincide with ours. But the embedded advisor, perceptive enough to identify where there is a unity of interest, now you can move mountains. And I'll quote a 13th century Persian poet, Sadi from Shiraz. The Persians claim he's Persian, the Kurds claim he's Kurdish because he's from a Kurdish part of Iran. And he said, joint interests make for the best of allies. And that's as true today as it was back then.
Those of you in the audience notice the photos that are coming by us that show the general's experience, and they're incredible photos. How much language training did you get?
There wasn't much, Mark. We had about 2 months in which to train for Arabic. We thought our teams were headed to link up with the 9th Infantry Division of the Iraqi Army, which was in Baghdad at the time. And so we had been studying Arabic. And it wasn't until we were on the ground in Kuwait as the last week of training before we deployed into theater that we found out that we weren't going to Baghdad, we were going to Kurdistan. And I remember very well, this Army major came into our tent. We were loading ammo because we were going in the next day. And he says, sir, we've confirmed your final location. I said, great, where is it? And he says the name of the town. And I said, BS. I actually didn't say BS. I said, BS, I don't believe you. Call him back, have him spell it. So he takes off, and I turned to the guys on the team. I said, guys, if that major was right, you just won the lottery because it's Kurdistan. And it turned out that's what it was.
You said once, I would rather take a unit with will over that of one with ability any day of the week.
Yeah. Well, that's because any of us can always deal with a lack of capability. We can train harder, we can train longer, we can train smarter, we can equip better. But changing their will to fight, that's a different matter, and we kind of got to this earlier. What are those motivations that would create this will to prevail, this refusal to submit, this tenacity? I'll take a unit with that.
You once said that your experience with the Kurds helped shape the second part of your life. What was that? When you say the second part, what are you referring to?
Well, after I came back. All right, because after serving with these very loyal allies and realizing the terrain they sat on had such geostrategic relevance to not just them, but to us, to the Europeans, that I realized more Americans need to understand much more about these very good allies. And you know, when ISIS attacked in 2014, when the Iraqi army ran away, the Kurds stepped forward. They stepped forward immediately and established a 1,000-kilometer border front line against ISIS troops, against ISIS terrorists, jihadis. And the truth of the matter is the black flag of ISIS has never flown on Kurdish-controlled soil. And you know, when you ask my Kurdish friends about this, they'll tell you. I mean, they've told you. They've seen some very terrible things out of history, and they're determined not to see that again.
Were their armaments largely from us, or were they from a whole variety of sources for the Kurds to fight?
You mean the Kurdish weapons?
Yeah.
Well, they were primarily still using Soviet bloc stuff.
Really?
Yeah. And they, like a lot of the indigenous units over there. One of the problems we dealt with in a Peshmerga unit was getting the same equipment that the rest of the Iraqi army was getting, because although we were a brigade of 3,300 Peshmerga, that's the Kurdish fighters. That name, by the way, when translated from Kurdish, means those who face death. Kind of gets right to the point. Rebadged as a brigade of the Iraqi army, but our ability to get the same equipment that the Iraqi army was getting was very difficult. So we couldn't get body armor until very late in the game. We had thin-skinned vehicles when the rest of the Iraqi army was running around in up-armored vehicles. We had no mortars. We had no sniper weapons. We were not allowed RPGs. So it was pretty much AK-47s, Dushka heavy machine guns, and PKCs.
And did they have plenty of ammunition, even though they were Russian?
Yeah, we had plenty of ammunition. Yeah.
I think you said that in reviewing other discussions you've had, that the Kurds are now, I believe you said, 97% Sunni now. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Did that number jump greatly?
No, they've been Sunni. Now, I'm going to repeat something that they said to me, okay? So I want to make that clear.
Okay.
Kurdish comrades. They said, you know, brother, we weren't always Sunni. We were forced to be Sunni. Forced to be. Because they had pre-Christian religions that they practiced. Zoroastrianism. So this Zoroastrianism, there were, you've heard of the Yazidis. That's another indigenous religion. There were a group called the Kakai. Also Christian, there were Kurdish Christians and Kurdish Jews as well. So they're about 98% Sunni now. And then there's another small percentage of everything else. There's a growing movement now to return to Zoroastrianism amongst the Kurds. And there's a lot of interesting dynamics associated with that, by the way. And they will tell you this, Mark, that they are an anomaly in the Middle East, where everybody else defines themselves, identifies first by their religion. The Kurds identify first by blood. They are Kurdish first. Everything else is second.
Yeah, I heard you say that they identify themselves by blood.
Yeah.
So they instinctively know when they come across someone they've never met before, they'll know if they're Kurds.
Well, the language is different, so they're going to know.
Yeah.
They're going to know.
It's a fascinating thing because most Americans, you have said that most Americans, if not at least many, have a great sympathy to the Kurds.
Well, I think that has been a recent development, Mark. I mean, since 2014, prior to 2014, I would submit that most Americans hadn't really heard of the Kurds. 2014, they stepped forward, as we now know, and they held the line on ISIS. Had they not done that, not just Mosul would have fallen to ISIS, but Kirkuk as well. Kirkuk would have been in ISIS' hands had the Peshmerga not stepped forward.
How did they feel about us at the beginning? Were they trusting? Were they at arm's length?
They love Americans. All right, so a comrade had said this to me once before. He said, well, for the audience here that doesn't know this, the Kurds of Iraq, now there are Kurds in Turkey as well. That's the largest population, but let's say 20 million. There's probably 7 or 8 million, 7 million maybe, 7.5 in Iraq, maybe 6 in Iran, 2 or 3 million in Syria. Kurds in Iraq were the subject of genocide at the hands of Saddam Hussein. Predecessor regimes also waged war against the Kurds in the north. Saddam Hussein hit the Kurds with chemical weapons at least 48 times. Halabja was the biggest. 4,500 Kurdish villages were surrounded as part of the Anfal final solution for the Kurds. This was the name that Saddam gave to his effort to exterminate them. 4,500 villages surrounded by military units. then bombed into rubble. Of course, as the villagers displaced out of the rubble, they were scooped up by the cordons and transported to what Saddam called strategic resettlement camps, or new cities, but in plain language, they were concentration camps. So there are probably a half a dozen of these, at least within a half-hour drive of my safe house, former camps for the Kurds. And then in Kurdish soil, large swaths of it were designated prohibited zones. And by that, and I have some language from, I think it was Ali Hassan Majid, who some here may know, later earned his name Chemical Ali. Ali Hassan Majid was Saddam's cousin. I think it was his order, establishing the prohibited zones on Kurdish soil. No living thing was permitted, not an animal, not a Kurd. So what my comrades had said to me was, you know, when we were being exterminated, we were Muslims surrounded by Muslim countries, they didn't come to our aid, but the Americans came to our aid, and they've not forgotten that. And consequently, they are very close to the Americans, and even though that's been a challenging relationship for other reasons.
Earlier this year, you said that there are 5 very common interests between the United States and the Kurds for the future of Kurdistan. Can you tell us, General, what some of those are?
Well, let me start by this. So if you're going to talk strategy, right, you've got to realize a certain fact of life. And it's kind of unseemly, I think, to speak like this, but it's this. The essence of rational behavior is acting in your self-interest. I mean, it's a fact of life, right? And so if you're going to craft a strategy, if you're going to even ask a question about any part of the globe, you could ask, all right, what are our vital national interests there? You got to start there. And in practical terms, well, first, we can debate this all day long, but in practical terms, it's really the president who, in the end, determines what those vital national interests are. If I was sitting in the White House, those 5 that you probably saw before, to me, are very vital. And I think they are practically indisputable. And here it goes. First, the destruction of ISIS, right? Will we dispute that's not in our interest? No, of course not. 2, the defeat in the long war to undermine jihadi ideology. I think that's in our interest as well. 3, the promotion of democracies. I think we can all agree that's in our interest. I'm not saying nation building. That's a different matter, and I may or may not think that always fits. But the promotion of democracy. 4, the reestablishment of a balance of power in Iraq, Syria, that part of the Middle East. Since American troops were pulled out of Iraq in 2011, Iran has emerged as the dominant power in the Middle East. Period, exclamation point. All right? They are rapidly establishing, they've established now their land bridge across Kurdish soil, across Iraqi soil, across Syrian soil, all the way to their Hezbollah allies in Lebanon, on the Mediterranean, and the back door into Israel, right? And their Russian allies are riding that like a racehorse. So that's 4 interests that we have in this part of the world that Kurdistan sits on. The Kurds are essential for destruction of ISIS. I think I know they were the main effort in that war. Their moderate voice in Islam, Sunni Islam, is important for the long-term debate that must occur within Sunni Islam. Our voice is not going to be that strong. It's not a good voice for that. That's a debate that must occur within Sunni Islam. Our role for that is to identify, support, promote, and if we need be, defend those moderate Sunni voices that are out there so they can have a longer duration in this debate. That's in our interest. 4, counterbalancing the Iranian might now. The Kurdish soil was the last piece of soil open and welcoming for a counterbalance to the Iranian power in the region. And here's the fifth, and this is very important. Iraq's combined oil reserves are second in OPEC, second only to Saudi Arabia. The Kurds sit on 1/3 of that. They've never really been able to exploit their own oil until recently. But when you look at access to energy, maintaining access to energy is not just in our interest, it's in Western interest. Turkey imports 35% of its annual oil from Russia and 60% of its natural gas. The European Union is even worse in terms of its dependencies on Russian oil, Russian energy. It starts with 30% and 40% in the Central European countries, and it rapidly goes up into the Scandinavian countries to close to 95% for some of them. The European Union is so concerned about this over-reliance on Russian energy that in 2014 they published an energy independence strategy purposed largely to diversify away from Russian energy. But who else is dependent on Russian energy? Moscow is. Moscow is. Because 52% of the Russian budget comes from the export of oil, the revenues off their oils. 70% of Russian exports are energy. And 84% of those exports go to whom? The European Union. Now, the Kurds can help the Europeans break free from this. They're not going to do it alone. The Americans can too. So I've covered 5 interests. Kurds are essential to interests that are vital to the United States. And I submit they are vital, but of course, reasonable minds can debate that.
I'm going to ask Tony if you can put the map of the region up so that I can ask the General for his opinion on some areas. Then we're going to go to your questions from the audience in a very quickly moving hour. Do you worry, General, about the Iranians fulfilling that threat to close the Straits of Hormuz?
Well, do I worry? Well, I mean, it's a concern. But remember, they've done this before. 1988. Do you remember the tanker wars in 1988? The Iranians said they were going to close the Straits of Hormuz. We said, that's not a good idea. They tried it. We sunk half the Iranian Navy.
Wow.
And then they stopped. So we can do that again.
They're not any better than they were.
No, the Persian Empire has never been a sea power. So I'm not making light of it. They certainly have ship-to-ship missiles. They've got it. But practical realities are it would be a bad idea for them to try this again.
Since this is a general's view, I know the audience is eager to hear your thoughts on where Syria is now in all of this.
Yeah.
Is that slipping away from us or what?
Well, here's where Syria comes into play in a big way. Let me start it with this. ISIS is never going to hand the United States a strategic defeat. The Iranians allied with the Soviets, with the Russians, yes, when they displace us, if they displace us from our interests in the Middle East, that's a strategic reversal. Okay? So in 1972, Anwar Sadat woke up one day, picked up the phone, and he called comrades Kosygin and Brezhnev. And he said, hey, campers, remember these 15,000 Soviet advisors you have on the ground in Egypt? Yeah, well, I want them gone by the end of the week. And so, I'm sure over a couple of stiff stalagmites in Moscow, they say, hey, what the heck just happened? Well, Sadat wasn't done yet, because a couple of years later, he revoked or shortly afterwards, he revoked the Cairo-Moscow Friendship Treaty, so that went, and then the coup de grace was Sadat's signature on the Camp David Accords. So practically overnight, the Soviets were out, the Americans were in. The Russians have been waiting 45 years for this chance to get back into the Middle East. With the Iranian press to establish their crescent across Iraq, across Syria, all the way to the Mediterranean, the Russians have ridden that like a racehorse. The Russians have had a naval base at Latakia in Syria on the Mediterranean shoreline. They've built that out in the last few years. They've added an air base just north of that in Latakia. And here is a very important point. They have installed S-400 missiles at that air base near Latakia. 250-mile range, folks, that extends 250 miles out into the Mediterranean. That's our neck of the woods. So this is called an anti-access area denial bubble. It's the third such bubble the Russians now have on NATO perimeter. That's a big deal.
There was a report this afternoon by the Wall Street Journal. Assad reported to have approved a gas attack. Bashar al-Assad had approved a gas attack in the Idlib province, which is the country's last rebel stronghold. Report came out on Saturday. Is this guy going to be tried for war crimes at some point? They're just going to grab him and try him, or what?
Well, that's, you know, that kind of thing is determined by the victors, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the victors kind of write history. We got to win it. We got to win it.
Turkey, which has been an ally, member of NATO, they have a funny relationship with us. They don't like us flying over their area if we're going into certain places. They've got a refugee problem. They're worried about it. Their southeast border, I believe. Where are we with Turkey? I almost feel, General, that they were neglected at some point. They felt neglected. They tried to get our attention. What's the deal?
Well, it's deeper than that, Mark, right? I mean, it's definitely deeper. I mean, with Erdogan, his arrival on the scene some years ago, I mean, one of the first efforts that he was involved in was the criminal investigations. I think it was called the Ergenekon investigations of the Turkish military, because he knew if he was to establish himself as a truly powerful Turkish leader, he would have to bring to heel the Turkish military, which was always and always considered itself the defenders of the Ataturk legend, the Kemalist legend, which kept Turkey secular. And, of course, the Turkish military has had a few coups over time. When the civilian leadership seemed to be straying a little bit too much in the other direction, the military stepped in, for better or worse, but it happened. Erdogan knew that that could be an issue in the future and began the criminal investigations, and overnight, or over the course of a few years, the top layers of leadership across the military, they were put in jail. And a new crop has come out. That was the beginning of the preparation for Erdogan of where he is today, and he's just recently passed through last year some constitutional amendments, let's say, that now accrete power in him almost as the unprecedented levels. So that's a problem. Now, Turkish foreign policy in the region has long been purposed overwhelmingly to disrupt the formation of a contiguous Kurdish belt across Turkey's southern border. So that's the border with Iraq, northern Iraq, and northern Syria. It's caused Turkey to do several things that I think backfired on Turkey. We're here talking about Kurds in large part because of not just ISIS, but Turkish attacks on the Kurds. You know, there's been an ongoing violent repression in southeastern Turkey for many years. It forced the PYD, which is the Kurdish group inside, the Kurdish political group inside Syria. The YPG is their armed wing. They comprise the Syrian Democratic Forces, which we are embedded with now, to prosecute war against ISIS in Syria, but it's brought the PYD into closer coordination with the Kurds of Iraq. This was thought impossible to have occurred, but it has happened in the last couple of years. Now, I'm not saying they're kissing cousins yet, but it's brought them together. And it's built worldwide sympathy, or it's increased it in terms of the Kurdish struggles. Kobani, everybody watched Kobani as the Turks were where ISIS was besieging Kobani right up against the Turkish southern border, and the Turks refused to do anything until they They eventually took great pressure from the United States to admit some refugees.
Want to touch upon Israel briefly, because you mentioned about this influence of the Iranians that goes all the way out, extends itself almost to the Mediterranean. Are they just trying to subtly build their influence so they can be in a closer position to hit Israel? Or is it to build regional power and then deal with the Israelis later? They seem to have a long-term plan, but I'm not sure what it is.
Well, their long-term plan, I mean, you can ask President Rouhani or Ayatollah Khamenei. You can ask General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, their special forces. You can ask them what their plans are for Israel, and that's to destroy it. You can argue there is no Iranian interest that's served by that, right? So war, in the Western tradition, as we understand war is politics by extreme measure. Sounds crazy, right? Sounds crazy, but it's a fact. Politics is our system of nonviolent conflict resolution. Every debate we have on the floor of the Senate, the floor of the House, that's really a potential fight, Mark, isn't it?
Yes.
But we don't fight. We vote. And somebody goes away sad, but accepts it, right? At some point, the first bullet flies. And now you start to have the first stages of war. But if war is politics by extreme measure, that also means that there is a political issue in dispute, that one side can concede to the other and the war ends. This is our Western tradition. But how does that explain wars, jihads? How does that explain violent holy war, which is waged on the basis of faith? Politics is a function of reason, wherein you act in your self-interest. Faith is something else. How do you concede your faith? So you can't do that. So we've got an Iranian regime that just wants to destroy Israel, all right? It doesn't seem to be in Iranian interest to do that, but they have the faith that they want to do that. All right, so if that's the case, they have established a land bridge all the way to the Mediterranean. They've moved significant combat power there. They have a model for co-opting local forces. In Yemen, they've done this. They've done this in Lebanon. They're doing this in Syria, and they've done it in Iraq, where they move in their special forces, and it's really an unconventional warfare effort. They're wearing the uniforms of the host nation. They bring in missiles. They bring in even missile factories. There are missile factories going in. Hezbollah now has about 130,000 rockets and missiles in the neighborhood, or in and around Israel right now. Significant number, right?
So, General, following that theme, do the Iranians, as well as others that are enemies of Israel, try to infiltrate the political scene of Israel by getting candidates elected to their elected body, the Knesset?
Well, I don't know if they're doing that. Maybe they are, right? But their effort has been one to co-opt the neighboring countries. That's for sure. And they move in lethal capabilities, but they continue to wage these at levels calculated to be just below where there might be a decisive response by somebody else, like the United States in this matter.
I want to ask you about the PLO, because today the Trump administration announced they will close the Palestinian Liberation Organization's mission in Washington, citing Palestinian leaders' resistance to peace talks and attempts to get an international court to prosecute Israel for alleged war crimes. Surprised by that? I was a little surprised to hear that they made that announcement today.
Yeah, I didn't hear that announcement.
Been out there for a while, yeah. Apparently. According to one of our sources, the thing has been in Washington for a long time. Shutting it down, is there going to be any kind of a problem because we did that, do you think?
Yeah, you know what? I think I would have wanted to hear the darn announcement today and read through that and see what was in that one.
This marks the latest blow by the United States against the Palestinians amid a stalled Mideast peace process. We're going to take your questions if you want to come down. And we have 2 microphones set up. If you ask a question direct of the general, well, students first. Let's waste no time. Come on down because we're live on this program. We don't take a break. You need to come down as opposed to just raising your hand. Ask your question directly of the general. Were they surprised, waiting for students to come down, I want to ask you, General, were the Kurds surprised by technology, the amount of technology we have, and did they welcome it and say, when do we get some?
Oh, yes, they love technology. In fact, we used to call it the Kurdish national flower. You couldn't find a 1,000-year-old technology home, mud bricks, flat roofs, dirt roof, without a satellite dish on top. Powered by a portable diesel generator. By the way, can you get those photos running again?
If you would you state your first name and what your field of study is here, and then your question direct to the general?
Certainly. My name is Connor, and my field of study right now is aeronautical science.
All right, Connor.
Okay. Your question?
So, first of all, sir, I believe I speak for many of us here when I say thank you for your service.
Oh, well, we have a great country. Thank you.
Yes. My question to you is, we've seen that it's a big argument on both sides regarding whether or not the interpretation of Islam in the Middle East, especially with these militant forces such as the Islamic State, is true or not. And some say that it is true in the sense that it is 7th century crude pure Islam, which is not fitting in the 21st century, which could be said for many religions, such as Christianity, such as Hinduism, while I might believe the same thing. Do you feel that, is it their interpretation that is very, very strict and adhering to that religion that is just not fitting in today's society, or do you believe that they have got it entirely wrong and it is indeed a modded version of what they perceive Islam to be? Thank you.
Well, the short answer is I don't agree that Islam doesn't fit into the 20th century. Now, here's the point. The point of the matter is, Islam, like many religions, is not homogenous. There are many schools of thought within Islam. And when I use the term jihadi, I'm using the term that my Kurdish comrades applied to those who are prosecuting violent jihad against us. Okay, that's their term, that's why I use it. So Islam is broadly practiced across the globe. We're not at war with Islam, but there are people within Islam that are engaging in jihad. So we're not at war with all Islam. I have thousands of friends who are Muslim.
Actually, what I meant was, I did not say that Islam is not fitting in this modern society. What I meant was, there is a time frame of what is acceptable when and where. For example, in its very crude form, because again, all of it's based on interpretation. There is no one set meaning. And what may be interpreted in one way in the 7th century, when the Quran was written, when the Holy Quran was written, might not be applicable today or acceptable today, such as with many other religions or many other thoughts, many other ideas. Do you believe that their interpretation is that of the 7th century that is just not fitting today, or do you believe that it's wrong entirely, is what I had asked?
Wow. That's a tough question. It comes to a religious conclusion, which we're talking military strategy and governmental. It may be something for another discussion, but I don't know if we can get an answer here, General. Do you?
No, except to say that there's, Islam's just not homogenous. There are many different schools of thought.
Thank you anyway for your participation.
All right,
let's come over here and your question now for the General.
Hello, my name is Chasen Parker. I'm studying social sciences and humanities here, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on the Israeli-Palestine conflict and the world's role in it.
Question on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And then he added something on that.
And the last words, if you could again.
And the world's role in it, as far as the U.S. and the rest of the world.
I'm still having trouble making out what you're saying, sir. Try again.
The world's role in it? The world's role in the conflict?
And the world's role in the conflict. Does the world in general have a role in trying to satisfy this situation?
Well, we have interests, right? I mean, it begins with what are our interests. So, you know, Israel right now, from an American perspective, remember I started by saying it is rational behavior to act in self-interest. It seems unseemly, it just doesn't seem, you know, nice, but that's the truth. And so you have to look at this from the American perspective, which is how I do it. What are our vital national interests involved in Israel? And one is a big one. It is a friendly, actual democracy in that part of the world. We have an interest in promoting democracy. Democratic countries just don't go to war with each other, right? Democratic countries engage in a free market of ideas and a free market of goods. We exchange with each other, we debate with each other. We just don't go to war with each other. That's in our interest. So yes, we've got an interest in Israel. We've got an interest in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but that's just not an easy matter, is it? That for us to stay the course, this is the first step. We must make the case, and the only one in this country who really can't escape from that responsibility is the president. He has to make the case that anything of this nature is in our strategic interest, that it's high value. Help us understand that, right? Because if it comes to war, it's the value of the objective, and I'm not saying this is going to come to war, but if it comes to war, it's the value of the objective that determines the magnitude and the duration any nation, the magnitude and the duration of the war any nation will wage in its pursuit. If it's a low-value objective, we're just not going to put up with much before we go home. High-value objective, everything is on the table. So if it's a high-value objective, we're with it for a long period of time. And I think that's the best we can apply at this point.
General, tomorrow's 9/11. To do a sidebar here, where were you on 9/11?
Yeah, I was out at Fort Lewis in a Stryker brigade. We was commanding a cavalry squadron in the Stryker brigade. We just finished a 2-week exercise. We were in the field. We had NDEX, which is end of exercise. It came at about 2 in the morning. Our stand to, I think I set that at 5:45. I just slept on the hood of my Humvee as usual, and I pulled back into the our Tactical Operations Center, headquarters in the field, which is mobile. And at about 5:40, my XO came out, executive officer came out, who had been on inside maintaining the shift, keeping the radios. And he says, "Hey, sir, first plane hit the World Trade Center, or a plane has just hit the World Trade Center, and it looks like reports are it's terrorism." And I got up in time to walk over to our fire support element, who had a small TV in the field, portable thing, and we saw the second plane hit.
Where did you go from there?
Well,
did they scramble you or what?
Well, no. I mean, we were the Army's first 2 Stryker brigades at the time, so we were designed to be highly deployable, and we thought we were going to go. But the first instance was the wives, the families, back on post. They wanted us home now, right? But we still had responsibilities out there in the field. You can't just leave the field. So that was a concern, trying to maintain the folks at home who just thought the sky was falling down, and trying to collect up ourselves and make sure we had everything we needed before we went back in.
Let's come back to questions now from the audience. Your first name and your year of study and field, please.
Yes, sir. Good evening, General. My name is Ryan. I'm studying unmanned aircraft systems. I'm currently a junior. I recently came back from a study abroad in Kosovo, and we toured around the Balkans in general, saw a lot of what the UN mission had done there. To my understanding, the situation we're looking at with the Kurds in particular is similar in a way, with a lot of ethno-nationalist groups coming together with clashes of interest. In the Balkans, we had a really heavy international presence with UNMIK and KFOR deploying there. But at the same time, that was not really effective in clearing up the issue at all. How would you place a solution like that in Syria, in Iraq, in solving these sort of issues?
Yeah. Easy question, right? You know, nature abhors a vacuum. So does foreign policy. So does national security. I hate to put it this way, but negotiators and loafers come face to face with smash mouth and dusty boots in places like Syria. I don't think that's going to be solved for the long haul without the application of significant combat power. The Iranians right now are providing about 80% of the combat power on the ground. Russians have a few thousand troops there. Nobody there is interested in negotiating. Sad to say. Yeah. That answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you. Over here now, your question for the General.
Thank you, General. My name is Brad. I'm a junior here at Embry-Riddle. I'm a global conflict studies major. I'm also minoring in Arabic, terrorism studies.
All right. Yeah.
I was deployed to Iraq in 1991 as part of the ground combat forces that fought there in the Persian Gulf War.
All right, thank you.
And my question to you tonight, sir, is in regards to self-interests in nations that you talked about and how they act, supposed to act in their rational self-interests. And specifically, do you feel, in your opinion, that Iran and the Soviet Union are acting in their rational self-interest in the Middle East vis-a-vis some conflicting signals from Washington regarding the Iran deal and how the current administration has kind of flip-flopped on the Russia situation? And is that in response to whether we perceive it as aggression or not, an increased presence in the Middle East from the United States? Are they responding in a rational self-interest, in your opinion, sir? Thank you.
All right, so I'll take part of that first. So if you're sitting in Moscow, it makes perfect sense to displace the United States from its interests in the Middle East. Perfect sense. Look, they've now got an A2AD on the Eastern Mediterranean, right? That's new. That's within the last couple of years. That's because they've been inside Syria. Yes, it's in their interest to also appear as a capable negotiator, which is why they've just had a Tehran-Moscow, Damascus three-way meeting. Okay, that's on Idlib, by the way. They're going to try to figure out what they're going to do about Idlib. So it is in Russian interest. Remember, 1972, they experienced a strategic reversal over there. They've been waiting 45 years to take that back. So they're trying. Now, they're not going to want to go to war with the United States. They just don't have the combat power, what have you. But it doesn't mean they won't continue to operate to destabilize our interests, to drive wedges. And nations have, there are four elements of national power. Military is just one. Diplomatic, information, and economic are the other three. The Russians are applying all four of those in Syria, right? And they've got the muscle of the Iranians. At this point, I think even the Russians would admit that they can't quite fully control the Iranians on the ground. The Iranians are absolutely focused on victory, okay? Now, I'm going to draw an analogy real quick. People don't like to talk about Vietnam as in the same breath as modern operations. But I think we need to do this because there are real lessons there. In Vietnam, we were on the strategic defensive, but we didn't really know it. We conducted tactical offensives all the time. In fact, unit to unit, we were essentially unbeatable on the ground. But we never took the war to the source of the war. We were allowing ourselves during Vietnam to commit the bulk of our combat effort against the Viet Cong. The North Vietnamese army, the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong almost didn't enter into their calculus. Hanoi believed that the final conquest of the South was the victory that they were after, that they never got off of that. That was their goal. They were very clear on that. That was their strategic offensive. Tehran has something similar. They are on the strategic offensive. That's to get all the way to the Mediterranean and get in place where they can compel Israel in various ways, if not destroy Israel.
So you're thinking history could repeat itself.
Yeah, and I'll also say this, Mark. Well, we have to learn from history, right? We have to be honest about
we're destined to repeat it.
All right? You know, in Vietnam, our effort there wasn't challenged because we had a misunderstanding of counterinsurgency theory. We fought a capable counterinsurgency against the Viet Cong. I mean, after the Tet Offensive in '68, they were practically decimated, right? All right? We failed because we were challenged because we failed to appreciate and understand those long disfavored theories of conventional war. All right? We are being sidetracked now, or at risk of being sidetracked by years of counterinsurgency effort against ISIS. ISIS, as I said earlier, is never going to hand us a strategic defeat. Allowing the Russians and Iranians to displace us from our vital interests in the Middle East, that's a strategic reversal.
Let's come over here. Your question now for the General.
Good evening, sir. My name is Kyle, and I am a global conflict studies major.
All right.
I'm a freshman. My question is for you. While the nation itself, and also, as you stated, the Kurdish role in that, and its primary objectives, for the Army in particular, and especially for the psychological operations and civil affairs component of the Army, has that goal changed at all since the beginning of the war on terrorism in regards to the Middle East region, or has it changed at all since that point?
You mean PSYOPs particularly?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, we changed the name. Yeah, we changed it to something kinder and gentler. It was Military Information Support Operations or something. I can't even remember it. PSYOPs. Yeah, it's changed somewhat. I think if we're not clear about the type of war we're in, that's a great disservice to how we apply capabilities such as psychological operations. This is not me speaking. This is history. This is Clausewitz speaking. And he said, Clausewitz, the greatest the most influential military theorist in the Western Hemisphere, right? He said, the first supreme act of judgment that a statesman or commander must make is to establish the type of war upon which they're about to embark, neither mistaking it for or trying to make it into something that is alien to its nature. We have to be absolutely clear and honest about the war. We are in a war with Iran. Wars don't always involve just shooting bullets or even shooting bullets. You know, we've seen the Lebanese model, the Iranian model in Lebanon, the Iranian model in Yemen, the Iranian model in Iraq. Qasem Soleimani, again, the commander of the Quds forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, boasts today that they've turned the Iraqi army into a Hezbollah army. Can you imagine that? Right?
Sir.
Same thing's happening in Syria. So we've got to begin by being honest, and then we can have an honest appreciation of how to apply psychological operations.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks. Good
you.
question.
Back over here now, your question for the General.
General, my name is Connor. I'm
If you could
studying.
speak right into the mic.
Connor, common name tonight.
I'm a freshman studying software engineering.
Great.
My question is in regards to you stated as your fifth policy that Kurdish oil is key to breaking away the
it's a part
Russia
of it,
grip
yeah.
on the European Union. But do you believe that with the pushes towards more environmentally friendly energy types within the European Union that the Kurds could fall back into away from the world's eye?
Well, if you drive, have you been to Europe recently?
No.
All right. You can't get away from the wind turbines. They're everywhere. Everywhere. It hasn't tipped the balance yet. So maybe someday, right? Maybe someday the Europeans can draw the vast majority of their energy from stuff like wind turbines and who knows what else. But for the foreseeable future, they're going to need oil and gas.
If I may continue,
Sure.
if they haven't capitalized on their oil yet, when do you think they will? If they haven't yet, why would they now?
Well, that, Connor, is because they've never been allowed by Baghdad to exploit their own oil resources. And it wasn't until really after we went into Iraq, 2003, that the Kurds were able to build a pipeline north from their newly developed fields to Turkey. Now, against all conventional wisdom, if you listen to most people at the time, this was going to be highly destabilizing and provocative behavior. Guess what? It wasn't. Ankara helped them with this pipeline. Turkey needed more sources of oil. Ankara got a buck off that oil. Erbil got a buck off that oil. Everyone was happy, except Baghdad, except Tehran, except Moscow.
Thank you, John.
It was a unifier. Yeah.
Wow. Are American companies wanting to invest, but they're afraid of being nationalized once they get in there? Into Iraq.
In Iraq.
To
well, I can
rebuild.
say this. You'd have to ask the companies why they might stay away, but for a while I was kind of tracking this thing called the Erbil Business Expo. It was an annual conference they had in the Kurdish capital. And last time I checked, they had 800 exhibitors. How many were American? 2.
Wow.
2. Why?
That tells you something right there, General.
And they asked me, why are the Americans not here? The Americans were here fighting. The Chinese weren't. The Chinese are there now.
Yeah. Chinese are everywhere.
Yeah, Iran, the Iranians are there.
Hello, my name's Kyle. I'm actually studying aeronautics and minor in Arabic.
Can we call you Connor? We had 2 other
Yeah, I
Connors,
heard that too. My question was actually going to go off of Connor over there, but especially what should the U.S.'s next move be toward the, after the Kurdish referendum that happened within the last year and like high 90% range of Kurdish voting on it, and the army in Baghdad that's mainly a majority of the PMU Shias, what should they do to kind of prevent another Iraq war from happening? Because neither side is wanting to back down, even recently with the Peshmerga having to back off of Kirkuk with the high oil in those areas.
Well, who knows what's going to prevent a war over there, but the, for those that haven't tracked the history there the last couple of years, the Kurds are considered the largest nation without a country of their own, right? So they're split across 5 countries. Goes all the way back to Treaty of Versailles when they were promised a country. Then in the Treaty of Lausanne, they lost that. That was 1923. They lost that. So they've been split ever since. It's been a Kurdish dream to have their own independent country like everybody else. And they have, in my experience, when I was there on the ground with them, and I never saw them taking provocative actions on the ground. But instead, they were trying to use the Iraqi Constitution as it was written, okay? Starting with the Article 140 process, which set up a 3-stage process to resolve the so-called disputed areas. I don't really want to get too deep into the disputed areas in Iraq, but it's historically Kurdish, but Iraqi troops established a line across much of that, including Kirkuk, right? So they've been disputed. With Iranian help, that was all taken back on the 16th of October of last year. Anyway, so they've tried to use the Iraqi Constitution to resolve these issues. In 2005, a referendum was taken through the Kurdish region, and the question was this, simply, do you favor an independent, sovereign state? The response, 97%, yes, of course. Now, in 2005, we were on the ground there. Keep that in mind. In 2017, Massoud Barzani, president of the Kurdish region, went forward with another referendum. And the referendum simply asked the same darn question. Kurds, and this time he extended it to anyone else living in the disputed territories, whether you're Kurdish or not. So it was, frankly, a fairer vote. Do you want to be independent or remain in Iraq? This time, the response rate was a little less, but it was 93%. 93% voted in favor of independence. It did not mean that this was a declaration of independence. It was simply a statement of will of the people residing on the Kurdish soil. But for months on end, Baghdad and Tehran in particular said that this would result in war. If you go forward with a referendum now, you will bear the consequences. The difference this time is the Americans weren't there in significant strength on the ground. Okay? And on the referendum was held on September 24th, I think. October 16th, Iranian proxies invaded, took back Kirkuk, took several oil fields the Kurds had developed, basically half of Kurdish soil all the way to the Syrian border. So the dream doesn't go away. It's going to be hard to unring that bell for the foreseeable future, but they are trying now to continue to work and make the Iraqi constitution work, which does establish a process to resolve the disputed areas. But Baghdad has never liked Article 140.
Thank you. Before we get to this gentleman, I want to ask you, because this is a general's view, can you tell us, to your knowledge, is it true the North Koreans do have linkage to the Iranians? Because my follow-up is, are they taking us for a ride, or are they going to get out of this? I realize it's off topic, but I'm dying to get your thoughts on it.
Not knowing many North Koreans, Mark.
Well, the reason is they were identified by President Bush as the axis of evil. And so I'm like, what's their linkage?
They've been linked to the Syrian nuclear program, and they very likely have been linked to the Iranian program. And mind you, no matter what some of us might think about the nuclear deal, all right, I happen to think it was a good idea to pull out of it. But here's one point that is indisputable. If you're going to put together a regimen to inspect facilities just so everybody's on board, you know, above board, right, and honest, you must provide for unannounced inspections. I mean, it just makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the nuclear deal provided for regular inspections. That sounds great, doesn't it? Regular. As in, irregular is not mentioned.
Yeah.
Unannounced inspections are not allowed. Maybe that would uncover a few North Koreans.
There you go. Back over here, your question for the general, and still an opportunity, if anyone has a question, to step up before we wrap up.
Good evening, General. My name is Brandon. I'm a Homeland Security major and a Global Conflict Studies minor.
All right.
My question is actually going to move over to Afghanistan. I've done 2 combat tours, one as an embedded training team, and I know firsthand, coming the new guy on the ground, it makes it really difficult to learn the lay of the land, how people operate in that area. Regarding Eric Prince's privatization idea of the war in Afghanistan, what's your take on it?
So Eric Prince is the Blackwater guy, for those that don't know it. It's his company, right? He's the CEO.
Yes.
Of it, right? Yeah. He's come back with
Academy now, but yes.
Yeah, basically a concept to commit private mercenaries on the ground in Afghanistan and relieve the burden on the U.S. combat troops. My guess is, I mean, we already have guys like this. Everybody's got guys like this on the ground, primarily providing like security for, VIPs or what have you, convoys, what have you. But in terms of high-intensity combat, I doubt there's any private mercenary force that is going to be able to draw on the combat multipliers that we have within our government forces. It's just no way. I mean, I just can't even imagine how we can provide to them some of the intel that we generate on the ground and we share. you know. So I think there are limitations, serious limitations to that concept.
Over here, two last questions. First, your question for the General.
Evening, sir. First of all, thanks for joining us. My name is Vin. I'm a math major here in my junior year. You emphasized some very important points, such as changing someone's will to fight is difficult. Going along with that, the destruction of ISIS and undermining jihadi ideology were two big points. Destruction of ISIS seemed clear to define, at least in my head, in terms of taking out key leaders, taking out maybe some important assets, weapons, etc.
Killing people and breaking things. That's the basic recipe.
Fair enough, sir. And then undermining the jihadi ideology seemed rather difficult to quantize.
Yep.
Could you give us some examples of how that's defined?
I most definitely can. But first, let me start with this. A lot of people try to wring their hands and roll their sleeves up at the same time over wars or efforts to counter different types of ideologies, right? And they sometimes give up. Like, you can't win, you can't defeat an ideology, right? So I ask you this question: have we defeated racism? No, we continue to fight it, don't we? Because it's the right thing to do. Okay? Undermining jihadi ideology over time. And again, I'm using the term my Peshmerga comrades use, jihadi. Okay? Ansar al-Islam, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other groups. That's a long-term effort, and the enemy in this case has the advantage of persistence. Persistence is a function of the value of the objective. We've talked about the value of the objective, haven't we, right? High-value objective, you'll wage wars of great magnitude and duration in its pursuit. Well, that holds true with most human endeavors, not just war. So undermining jihadi ideology, I accept, is going to be a long-term effort. And I think the Western world doesn't have an effective voice in that. That's a debate within Islam. We've talked about Islam not being homogenous necessarily. And we're not at war with all Muslims. We're not. There's a fraction that we're engaged in combat with now. These jihadis. Okay. But the ideology is there. And that's a long-term effort. And I said, we've got to be perceptive enough to identify, promote, secure, and oh yes, if we have to, defend the moderate voices that are out there so that they can sustain until they win this debate. I'm going to ask you this, because some people will say you can never win this type of war. Does Spain today exist under a caliphate? Answer is no. Does Portugal? Does Greece? Does Sicily? Does the Calabrian coastline in southern Italy? No. Those were all, of course, conquered. 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, 10th, 11th. Okay? But they're not anymore. We have to look back and learn. There's a lesson there. How did that happen? Right? How did that happen? And I don't really know the full answer, but it happened. So I have faith, right? Confidence that if we understand these types of histories, it's going to help us find the path for the future. Thanks.
One last question.
Good question.
Good evening, General. My name is Eric, and I'm an aerospace physiology major here at Riddle.
All right.
And my question would be, how do we avoid an all-out conflict in the Middle East, given that Iran and Russia are kind of working together to promote instability and kick out our interests in the region?
Yeah. But if they're trying to kick us out, and it comes to war, why would we not? I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, do you just give up? Right? I mean,
I guess my question would be like, what are the chances that we get into a bigger conflict that would be more global?
Yeah. Well, I think chances are they're not minimal. It's there. Russia definitely does not want to go to war with the United States. Iran is they're both tremendously overmatched by our capabilities. But they will engage, in particular Iran, we expect they will engage in asymmetric capabilities, which, you know, it's the age of hybrid warfare. I talked about their models in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria. They threaten to shut the Straits of Hormuz. They export. Iran's the greatest exporter of national terrorism around the globe. They'll try that. But at some point, we've got to be clear what our vital national interest is there, and then make the case. And if the case is convincing to the public, which is our center of gravity, the domestic population, if we say it's worth fighting, it's worth fighting. You know? Now, can we avoid it? Sure, we can avoid it, but we've got to. The best way is to prepare for the worst. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Want to thank two of our students who work with us tonight, Diego and to Heather, who helped work. Tony Petro, who has been with us all these years and directing things from up above. Bob Score, our videographer tonight. Josiah and the security staff who worked with us tonight on this event. We'll tell you about what's coming up next 2 weeks actually from now. We're going to talk about sustainable growth in the area of expansion. Dr. Jeff Brown, Dr. Taylor Mitchell, and Clay Henderson will join us for discussion of smart growth and sustainability. Do we have enough water? Do we have enough land? Are we going to change the way we build homes and live? All of that on September 24th. We hope you join us here on the campus of Embry-Riddle. Once again, a really warm thanks to Brigadier General Ernest Audino tonight.
Thank you. This is great.
Great questions. Thank you all. Have a pleasant good evening.